Hi, my name is Steven, and I'm on the analytics team. Today we're going to take a look at alarms in analytics, including how to configure alarms, how to interpret alarms, and how to receive alarm notifications. So let's jump in. Alright, let's get started. Before we dive into alarm configuration, let's first see what alarms look like in analytics reports. So I'm currently on the status system page, and here we have the active alarms panel. Now this panel provides information on all the resources that analytics is monitoring that are currently either unavailable or having performance problems. And from an administrator standpoint, this is really important because it tells you which resources require your attention right now. So here we distinguish between two different types of states for resources. The first one is this red critical error, and that indicates that analytics believes this resource is down or unavailable, or maybe it just simply cannot be reached by analytics, and so this is something that you'll want to investigate right away. Alternatively, we also have this orange warning label that indicates that there's that resource isn't performing optimally, that there's some kind of performance issue. So for instance, we have a LA layers map service here, and it was a response time alarm that triggered when it took 11 seconds, and so this is probably longer than we'd ideally want to see. So going back to this first request failure alarm, I'm going to show you what it looks like when you expand the details there. And we had a request failure alarm, which means that we tried to make a request to this image service, and it either failed, or in this case, there was a parsing error on the response. And so this happens a lot when Archer server does actually send back a response, but that response contains an error message. And we can see from the response here that the error message was, could not access any server machines, please contact your system administrator. And so for an image service, this might mean that there's a disconnect between the geodatabase and the ArcGIS server, or maybe something similar. And so that will need to be investigated. And then also in this detailed panel right here, we show you when it was last checked. So analytics is going to continue checking a resource until it discovers that it's healthy, and then that resource will be removed from this panel. But we can see that this was checked relatively recently and it was still down, so it's likely still a problem. We also show when it entered the current state, so this is when it entered a broken state, and that was about a day ago, so we know approximately for how long this resource has been broken. And lastly, we show you within the last 24 hours how often it was down. So if a resource keeps going up and down, it's going to look like a spiky graph, but if it was just permanently offline, as this surface was, then you're just going to see a very straight line. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about alarm configuration. So another resource that's showing up here is this host server that has a maximum memory usage alarm where the RAM utilization is about 83% on that machine, which is above the threshold, the default threshold of 80%. But maybe we don't care unless a host server goes above 95% RAM utilization. And in that case, we would need to go and configure that alarm. So we're going to go to this server. From there, we're going to go to configuration. And from here, you'll see that there's an alarms tab, and this contains all of the alarms that can be configured for that resource. So in this case, we're talking about the memory usage alarm. Let's click to edit it. And you can see the current settings, so it's set to 80%. So if it goes above 80%, that's when it's going to trigger, and the number of occurrences. So if that was set to 2, it would need to be above 80% on 2 consecutive collection operations in order for the alarm to trigger. Now these options are grayed out because the Use Default Settings toggle is currently enabled. And what this means is that there are default settings for each resource type for each alarm. And so there are default server settings for the memory usage alarm that is set to 80, and those are applied to all of the servers by default. So I have two options right now. I can either change the default settings to 95%, which would then impact all of the servers, or I could override the default settings on this one server if I only wanted that to have a threshold of 95%. Now in this case, I actually want to set that 95% threshold and have it applied to all the servers. So I'm going to cancel out of here. I'm going to go to servers. And this page also has an alarms tab that has the default settings for all of those different alarm types. And I'm going to go to memory usage alarm again. And here I'm going to set it to 95% and hit save. So now if I go back here, you'll notice that it was set to 95% because it is inheriting those default settings. Let's say that for this machine, I actually care more about how much RAM utilization there is. And so I'm going to disable or override default settings and say 50%. I want to be notified as soon as memory usage is over 50% on this one particular machine, and hit save. And now let's go back to the system page and the active alarms panel to see what that looks like. So as you can see, the alarm for the other server that we were looking at before, QA1071, is gone, and instead we now have an alarm that's triggered for this other SBates VM machine at 63% because we lowered the threshold to 50%, which is exactly what we were looking for. Okay, so the Active Alarms panel is a good place to check on the state of your GIS environment, but you really want to be notified immediately when a resource goes down or starts to experience performance issues. And for this, you'll want to set up email and/or SMS text notifications. To do this, we need to go back to Configuration. Under the System page, there's a Alarm Recipients tab, and this Recipients tab should contain all the information of the individuals that wish to receive either an email or text message when there's something wrong with the system. Right now I'm going to add a new recipient, and I'm going to add myself, and I'd also add a phone number if I wanted to be contacted that way. At the bottom here is an option, Receive Notifications for all resources. So if I was to check this for email, for instance, I would then, this user at least, would receive all notifications for every single resource in the system, and no further configuration would be required. But in this case, I kind of want to fine-tune it a little bit and only add myself as a recipient to very select alarms so that I'm not inundated with emails. So I'm going to hit save. Also worth noting is that in order for Analytics to send out emails, you need to go into email settings to actually configure SMTP service settings, and similarly, you need to go into SMS settings to provide your Twilio account details if you wish to send out text messages. Now that I've added myself as a recipient, I'm going to go back to the original server that we were looking at. Go to the Alarms tab, and I want to be notified as soon as that server is unavailable, as denoted by this alarm. So I'm going to edit that, and under Email Recipients, I'm going to select myself. And by hitting save, I've now added myself to this configuration, and I'll be sent an email as soon as the alarm is triggered. There's a second way that you can add a recipient to an alarm, which is basically inline so that you don't need to go to the recipient's page. And this is, I can just type out a user, they don't exist, that's fine. I'm going to click Add New Recipient. I'm going to fill in the details of that user, hit save, and immediately they've been added, and they'll also be added to the global recipients list if you want to add them to a different alarm. So that concludes this tech tip. Hopefully you have a better understanding about how alarms work and how to configure them. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.